Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by congratulating the delegation of Algeria for convening this very important debate on African-led and development-focused counterterrorism. As we have heard here, terrorism's footprint in Africa has expanded significantly in the past years. As highlighted by the Secretary General's reports and other speakers, though the frequency of attacks might have decreased, fatalities have in fact increased in Africa. These terrorist groups are linked with transnational criminal networks which fund their activities through illicit means, such as drug trafficking, illegal mining, kidnapping for ransom, piracy, and cryptocurrency. A strong, effective, and coherent response that reflects the international community's collective commitment to defeat the scourge of terrorism is therefore essential in Africa as elsewhere. I would like to highlight the following points for consideration of the Council in this regard. First, the serious terrorist menace in Africa is not isolated. Its repercussions impact the whole world. We must resolutely stand against it and delegitimize any justification. The UN must play a leading role in formulating the global counter-terrorism response. Second, terrorist groups exploit new and emerging technologies to spread propaganda, transfer funds, and raise finances. The Delhi Declaration on countering the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes, adopted under India's chairship of the UN Counter-terrorism Committee in October 2022, marked an important step in addressing these threats. The adoption of the Algeria Guiding Principles on preventing, detecting, and disrupting the use of new and emerging financial technologies for terrorist purposes by the Security Council earlier this month, and the Abu Dhabi Principles on countering terrorist use of unmanned aerial systems fulfill two of the three key commitments outlined in the Delhi Declaration. 3. Terrorism must be tackled with a strict zero-tolerance policy, leaving no room for double standards. Terrorists have no allegiance to democratic principles or values. The ideological influence of ISIL and Al-Qaeda on their affiliates in Africa, along with their interconnected network, should not be underestimated. We must not countenance double standards in this battle. Terrorists are terrorists. There are no good and bad ones. Those who propagate this distinction have an agenda, and those who cover up for them are just as culpable. Fourth, to prevent conflict relapse and promote lasting peace and sustainable development in Africa, it is essential to adhere to key peace-building principles. The process must be nationally owned and led, focusing on the needs and priorities of host states emerging from conflict. Government should drive peace efforts while fostering governance structures and enhancing the participation of women and youth. Adequate resources must be allocated for capacity building and addressing long-term socio-economic development. Fifth, Africa's leadership in addressing its challenges through homegrown solutions must be fully supported. Regional security initiatives like the ATMIS AWESOM, SAMIM, MNJTF, and the G5 Sahel have demonstrated resilience in combating terrorism, driven by African countries with deep understanding of their issues, strengthening collaboration with regional and sub-regional organizations, as well as financial institutions. And this is vital to address developmental challenges aligning with the objectives of Agenda 2063. The international community should ensure sustainable financial and logistical support for these efforts. Mr. President, India has a long history of supporting Africa's counterterrorism efforts. Through our participation in UN peacekeeping missions in Congo, Sudan, and Somalia, and our India-Africa Defense Ministers meeting, we have focused on counterterrorism and capacity building. Through initiatives like ITEC, we have partnered with African security personnel on training, while institutions like the Center for United Nations Peacekeeping in India have enhanced peacekeeping capabilities in Africa. Further, India has been contributing proactively to enhance capacities of African states in combating terrorism. Since 2018, India continues to contribute to UNOCT's programs targeting capacity building of countries in East and Southern Africa on border management and countering financing of terrorism. India has a robust security partnership with several countries of Africa aimed at building capacities of security forces, including for countering terrorism. Our CT initiatives are also reflected in the multilateral framework in Africa. We are committed to strengthening every effort of African states to fight terrorism. The underlying philosophy of India's partnership with Africa is to empower African countries for a future that is founded on principles of inclusivity, sustainability, peace and prosperity, dignity and respect. I would like to recall here during India's G20 presidency, we facilitated the joining of African Union as a permanent member of the group. My Prime Minister, while addressing the Ugandan Parliament in 2018, had stated, and I quote, "As global engagement in Africa increases, We must all work together to ensure that Africa does not once again turn into a theater of rival ambitions, but becomes a nursery for the aspirations of Africa's youth, unquote. Mr. President, India has been a victim of cross-border terrorism for more than 3 decades and deeply understands the human cost of terrorism and its lasting impact on victims and families of victims. We stand resolutely with our African brothers and sisters against this scourge and believe that if we let them find African pathways for themselves, we could see the frequency of recurrence of conflict in Africa come down in the future. We are confident that we can make this promise a reality. I thank you, Mr. President.